Hey guys, wanted to go over a few things to keep in mind, and I'm going to kind of read off of here while I say them, just so I have my notes. These 8 things will really help you rock, I think, as you write things, and this helps maybe help you avoid some mistakes that people make. I'll also write these down so you guys have these. Number 1, be actionable. The writing needs to be something along the lines of the 4 things you can walk away and do right now, whether that's sales tips, marketing tips, leadership tips, whatever you're writing about. It needs to be actionable. Number 2, be careful with using metaphors. You don't want to be using a bunch of metaphors unless the guest or the host use them. If the guest or the host use them, then feel free to use it. But if you just are trying to make one up because you're trying to be creative, probably not the best time to use your creativity. Number 3, this isn't journalism. And a lot of you might come from journalism. I came from a journalism background. In fact, that's where a lot of content marketers come from. But we have to be careful when you come from journalism. We have this idea of you have to make sure you attribute everything correctly, make sure it sounds exactly like the host or the guest said it. We're actually not trying to do that at all. It's more like we're working in PR for both the host and the guest. It is our job to make both of them sound as good as possible. So this is not journalism. So a few ways that's going to come out. You don't need to quote directly. You don't ever need to use the word sick. You don't need to use ellipsis. You don't need to constantly say, well, Danny said or Cheryl said. You don't need to do that. In the intro, it's going to be very obvious who the host is because it's the same host on all the episodes. Most likely, that will be very clear. You are going to say who the guest or guests are, and it's going to be very clear. You're going to say something like, today we interviewed blah 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 Danny, who's the VP of marketing over at XYZ software company, and here's what he said about marketing. Boom, the 5 tips about marketing in a fast-paced environment, or whatever the topic might be. And you don't need to say, well, Danny said this, and Danny's idea was this. It's very clear that this was Danny's thoughts, so you don't need to attribute everything like that. Also, it's okay if the guest or the host or one of the guests, anyone involved with that podcast says something, it's okay to verbatim go ahead and write that without saying, Cheryl said this. It's very, very clear that this was a collaborative event, that this is what this podcast was. This is very normal in podcast writing. We've been doing this for a while. People are not like, well, I said that, not them. Everyone knows they're all talking. So that's just how that rolls. Also, with that, number 4, it's okay to make a basic rough transcript and then use that as your podcast or your blog content. A lot of our writers, and depending on the podcast episode, this works for a lot of them, you can basically take a rough transcript of everything that was said during the interview, and a lot of times it's question, answer, and when it has that format to it, you can basically use those questions as the subheadings to an extent. It doesn't necessarily be a question, you'll have to rephrase it, but then the copy right after that can be the 4th step in this marketing thing. So that's a way to do it, is just to use a basic rough transcript. Number 5, keep it short and skimmable. We want to keep this down to 700 to 800 words in most cases. If it goes over that, it needs to be for a good reason, and that's fine if you need to write 1,000 words, but typically 700 to 800 words, and use subheadings every couple hundred words. If you've got 3 paragraphs and no subheading, that's probably the max. Like we want to see a lot of subheadings. Basically, you want somebody to be able to skim over what you wrote and zero in on one thing. They can get the general idea just by skimming. Oh, I skimmed the whole thing. I already kind of have those 5 ideas. I don't have time to read the whole article, but I got those 5 ideas. Because if you can grab their attention that way, they'll probably zone in on one piece. They'll be like, this point number 2 looked really good. Let me just go ahead and read that real quick. Oh wow, that was interesting. I'm gonna go back and read the whole thing. That's kind of what we're after. So make it skimmable, and then go ahead and make it where they would get value from each subsection pretty much on its own. Number 6, don't use a lot of fluff. So I would use fluff there. Number 7, it's not story time. So the reason why we say that, we're not going to win a Pulitzer Prize necessarily for anything we write here, but we are going to create some of the best marketing content in the world, what we believe. So make sure we go ahead and do that. What you want is people to walk away and say, wow, those were the best 5 marketing tips I've ever read in my entire life. So we don't want to make this giant, long, personal story, even if, and this is another point here, another sub-point, but even if it was a personal anecdote where the guest and the host kind of got into this banter of this elongated sort of personal story, you need to be able to dive into that and pull that out. And that brings us to point number 8, which is be bold with your decisions and create some sort of marching orders. If they go into a long story and it just becomes a personal story of their college days or what they did at their business or how their business evolved, you need to be able to make a decision and be able to dive into that and say, okay, here's the 3 things I'm going to pull out of that and make it relevant to a broader audience. Okay? Thanks. Bye.